A first adventure in Bithynia. Tricked into signing a royal contract, Oliver Lamb has precious little time for preparations before he is whisked off to Basthinia. There, he must find a way to defend the country of Larbendum against an invasion of Sarkinthians, a southern tide flooding northwards and devouring everything in its path. Oliver and his school friends Sage and Peregrine must navigate their way through squabbling senators, secretive monks, and cumbersome bureaucrats in the capital city, Nova Mamoxa, in order to help put aside national prejudices and discover what is really blighting the lands of Bithynia. To manage this, Oliver not only adjusts to a new look, courtesy of a magical medallion, but also takes part in many hazardous adventures, underground and overground, upstream and downtown, before he comes face to face with the most dangerous enemy at Journey's End.
Welcome. Today we are talking to Hamish Williams. He's the author of The Southern Tide, and we're going to introduce him to you, or at least we're going to give it a try. Hamish, we know each other for a while now, so we just use each other's first name. Who is Hamish Williams? Can you define yourself?
Yeah. Firstly, hi, Jeroen. Thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here. I am originally from South Africa. If I define myself by my place of birth, I grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, right under the beautiful mountains in Cape Town, close to the sea. That's where I grew up and spent the first 25 years of my life, and then after that moved to the Netherlands, where I've been for the last 10 years. Personally, in terms of my career, what I do, I'm primarily an academic, so a teacher and a researcher at university, and we'll talk a bit more about that, I think, a bit later. But that's my kind of job. But my passion is really writing in all different kinds of ways: creative writing, more non-fictional academic writing. I love words. I love writing, and I think that's a large part of who I am. I'm also a father. I have two kids, and I'm very busy there when I'm not doing work. So but I think that's pretty much who I am.
Yeah. You were born in South Africa, Cape Town, you said. Why did you come to the Netherlands?
Not for the mountains.
No, I assume the Netherlands is quite flat by comparison.
It's slightly different terrain, you might say. Having grown up in Cape Town, we have mountains and sea, and here, well, we have the sea still, but you don't have the mountains, so it's a bit different. But my reasons for moving were mainly personal. So I met my wife actually in Cape Town. She was on a research leave, and she was then teaching at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And so I kind of gradually, as our relationship developed, I was coming more and more often to the Netherlands, and eventually I immigrated in 2015. And we've lived in various places, and I enjoyed very much the Netherlands. We've lived in The Hague first, then Leiden. Groningen's our normal sort of our normal camp, but now we're also living in Amsterdam. So I've seen quite a bit of the country, and it's I would say primarily for personal reasons, but I've also worked at various universities here. I've also worked overseas, in Germany, in Jena, central eastern part of Germany, and also in Warsaw in Poland for quite a while. So I've jumped about here and there in Europe, and I'm looking forward to seeing where I'll be in the next 25 years or
so. Your academic work, what do you do as an academic?
Well, I have some books to show you, but my original training was in what's called classics, which for those of you who don't know is that's sort of the study of ancient Greece and Rome, and I did that to the PhD level. I was very much interested in ancient epic, so epic poetry, epic literature, storytelling of Homer, of Virgil, and such writers. And I think after that, I gradually moved more into what's called classical reception. So that's kind of the legacy of the classical world in modern times. Anything after the fall of Rome, we can say. So I'm particularly interested in the reception of classics in fantasy literature. So a book I recently published is called J.R.R. Tolkien's Utopianism and the Classics. So the idea of the legacy of classics in the works of Tolkien, fantasy writer. I published another book about that called Tolkien and the Classical World. This book is an edited volume, which means that it's not only me writing it, but there's a number of other contributors who wrote chapters for this. I also work currently on the Minoans. The Minoans were a people who lived in the Bronze Age about 4,000 years ago in Crete. And I'm interested in how Minoans have been rewritten in modern literature in the last 100 years. So that's my main research. I'm actually getting into psychology at the moment. I'm doing a new degree because I believe in continual professional, we can say, development or continuous education in life. So I'm always trying to learn new things and take up new subjects and new disciplines. So I'm very much a believer in lifelong education. I think that's enough for my in terms of my academic career. Yeah.
Yeah. You published quite a few works, including works based on Tolkien, on the author of the Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and other works. How did you become interested in the Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien?
Yeah. Well, one's not really one shouldn't say this really, but I watched the film before I read the book. So that's a bit shameful, but it sort of shows my age as well. So if you remember, Peter Jackson's first film of The Fellowship of the Ring came out in 2001, and so I was then 13. So I'm showing my age a bit there. But that was my introduction to Tolkien, and I absolutely loved that film. I remember going to cinema and watching it, and immediately afterwards going to the library and picking up the Hobbits because I had to do it in order, and then Lord of the Rings, and just being spellbound by what I would call the depth of world building in Tolkien, which before that when you read a novel, it's like you're just reading the surface, the surface of something. But with Tolkien, it's really like you feel it's the tip of the iceberg what you're reading, and below the tip of the iceberg there's this huge mass of not just geography, places, but history especially, and
Lore.
cultures, and there's such a rich underbelly, and you're really kind of you're really, I think, drawn to his writings. Well, at least I was drawn to his writings through this kind of sense of depth and wanting to find out more. And there's other reasons why I like Tolkien's writing, the environmental themes in his writings, um, the ideas of utopian worlds, perfect worlds. So there are various aspects to his writings which I enjoy. I also like his presentation of characters, all these different types of characters, how different personalities, right? We have the Fellowship of the Ring. You have 9 different, wanderers, and they each have their own kind of archetypal character. You can think of it in terms of personality types and how they kind of work together and develop themselves. I think it's very interesting from a psychological point of view, also, Lord of the Rings. So
Do you
that's
have
some of my thoughts, but yeah. Sorry, Jeroen?
Do you have a favorite part?
Oh, what came into my head immediately was Moria, the Moria sequence, in the underworld in Moria from I think it's called a Journey in the Dark and then the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. Those 2 chapters were always my favorite growing up, and I'm rereading it to my son now. And the whole book we almost finished. We're at Mount Doom, I think, almost. And he also enjoyed Moria, so perhaps it's a genetic predisposition in my family. We love the Moria sequence. No, but I think a lot of people like Moria sequence. Now, as I reread the novels, I very much enjoy the Old Forest sequence with Tom Bombadil, perhaps because it wasn't in the films, and so it's quite enriching to read and to imagine, whereas the other sections were represented in the films, and we kind of have a clear picture. The Bombadil sequence and the Old Forest sequence are more enigmatic. It's not so tightly connected to the story. Yeah, I think I should stop there probably.
Yeah. Besides your academic works, you also write creative. We've published your book, Tales from Basthinia, The Southern Tide. How did that come to be? How did you start creative writing?
Yeah, well, to be honest, as long as I can remember, I always wanted to to be a writer. I think from a very young age, I remember just loving reading books. Firstly, when I was very young, going to the library and getting books out and reading, and then from a certain age, just starting to write creatively. I remember from age 10 writing short stories in creative writing class at school, and really loving that. I remember one of my first short stories, now just thinking about it, was actually a fantasy story, a short story about dwarves. And I think I think I must have been about 15, and my English teacher didn't like it very much because she said you should always write, realistic stuff, like sort of modernist Hemingway type, you should write literature about what's happening in the real world. So there was this kind of backlash against fantasy back then, I think, in schools, and I think there's still a certain bias against writing fantasy, in a sense that it's make believe, it's not real, it's
Escapism.
escapist,
Yeah.
it's escapist, it's things for little boys, etc. So it's a very condescending attitude to fantasy writing. At the same time, it's not true at all. Fantasy is actually very critical of society, and I'll get to that later. But for me, fantasy is a very relevant genre, and I think Tolkien also saw that, and I believe that as well. That it's a very critical genre of what's happening in society right now, but it uses imagination to frame it in a creative way.
Did that happen in ancient times, like the Roman and Greek eras? Did they use creative writing, or was it all about philosophy, about
Yeah,
worldly things?
yeah. I would say more so than perhaps we imagine. So you can think of works like the Odyssey by Homer, where Odysseus goes on these fantastic voyages in sort of this fantasy land and encounters an ogre, and he has to kind of fight his way out of the cave of the ogre using his trickery. He encounters a witch who has her tricks and tries to turn him into, tries to turn his men into animals. He encounters a many-headed monster. This is the stuff of fantasy. This is modern fantasy, really, as I'm narrating this. So this is ancient
But
literature from.
in those times, was it perceived as fantasy, or was it mythology? Was it history to
Yeah,
them?
it was perceived as mythology, I think, but it wasn't regarded as irrelevant. People enjoyed mythology and enjoyed telling the stories, especially in an oral environment. It was considered relevant. The fantasy genre, as such, only really arises in the 20th century or late 19th century, right, as a development from a combination of different genres, such as fairy tale and historical romance and
Like Jules
myth.
Verne and
Yeah.
H.G. Wells, things.
Exactly, the science fiction as well. So, I mean, Tolkien's a key figure in the development of fantasy, but yeah. But just to get back to your question,
Yeah.
we kind of you can see we can really waffle about this sort of subject for a long time, the two of us, about Tolkien.
Many
But
paths lead to Rome, right?
it is true. But so my point was about my early writing career, what my experiences writing fantasy. I remember when I was 15, that I tried my first novel, and I've actually lost that novel, but I wrote a whole novel. It was kind of like bad Tolkien fan fiction again with dwarves. I was somehow very interested in dwarves, and I had a catalogue of 6 heroes going on an adventure. I never really quite resolved it. I think it was uh, about 300,000 words eventually, so it was quite massive, but I ended up losing it. But I think it was very important just to develop the sort of the endurance which you need as a writer. You need this endurance, just keep going and keep writing. And I think that was a good skill I learned from that. And then I stopped writing for a while during university years, and kind of in the 2010s, I started writing short stories again for literary magazines. But I felt a bit kind of that short story form was, although I very much enjoy humoristic writing, and I think that comes across in my own writing. At the same time, I felt a bit limited by the short form, and so I kind of turned then to my current endeavors, my fantasy series, which I'm working on. I can talk a bit about the Basthinia series a bit, and the start of it, the Southern Tide. I don't know if we're going to talk about that, but I can say a bit about that first book, the
Yeah.
Southern Tide. Yeah, I
Let's
think I have
dive into it.
yeah. So here it is. So see it there, and so the idea of this book is, I guess I'll call the genre kind of critical fantasy. I like to call it. So it's available. It's accessible for children. I think from ages 8 and up. Although the level of English depending on your training and your background, might be a bit demanding. But I think from ages 8 and up, it's perfectly acceptable for younger children to read, but also for adults. So I really I think that the novel it can be read by any age, not just adults who are suffering from kind of Freudian regression or arrested development, who as we do, read Harry Potter and later in life
Yeah.
and these things. But I think it's interesting for both kind of types of reader, right? Young adults and also adults. The genre itself is kind of a mesh, so it's kind of like modern high fantasy, but there's also a bit of beast fable, what used to be called beast fable. It's kind of what C.S. Lewis does a bit with animals who talk, and so there's that element into it. And beast fables historically have a very much a moral element to it, and so do my stories. Although I'm not
Like
didactic.
La Fontaine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm not preaching in my stories. I'm not didactic in an ancient sense of like Aesop's fables and stuff with these beast fables. But I do write with a very clear kind of moral intent. I have a certain issue which is bothering me when I write a story, and this is kind of being resolved in the course of a story. And I think this is what makes it interesting for adult readers. So for the first book, the issue was really what I would call globalization. And it wasn't really conscious when I was writing it that this was the issue, but as I'm kind of reflecting and I read it again and I think about it, I see that I was really concerned with ideas of globalization, so environmental destruction, kind of what else? The war industries, uh, excessive luxury. I wouldn't say it's anti-capitalist because there's a sort of this trend to say everything's anti-capitalist or against that kind of that movement, but it's certainly anti-luxury, against environmental destruction, against kind of globalization, I would say broadly. So that was kind of the theme which was present throughout that book, but it's also very much readable for children because it tells a story of the adventures of 6 young children in this fantasy land, and it tracks the development of these children, right? So for the first novel, my main focus was on a character called Oliver Lamb. Okay, as his name indicates, his surname is Lamb, which is an English surname, but he's actually transformed into a sheep or a mountain ram during this adventure. And he's quite a stubborn character and quite solitary and likes to read his books and kind of he's a bit like Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit. He doesn't like to leave his home. In the course of the story, he starts to learn how to interact with others and to become a bit more social and open to the outside world beyond himself. So this is kind of a classic children's plot, we can say, or a character progression rather in a children's story. Okay, so now I'm going to read a short extract from my book, about a page. What I've decided to do is actually read the section which is based on the cover work of the book. See it there. It says again a shout out to Anki Eisman who did this beautiful cover work, and so I'm just going to read that narrative now, which is in chapter 12 called A Journey Underground. This is a very important chapter in the book because it's when the two of the main characters, Oliver and Peregrine, discover this yellow toxin, this poison, which is polluting the environment in Basthinia. Okay. Look over there, pointed Peregrine. A lush garden of lemon-green moss had colonized the roof and walls of the tunnel, and from this nurturing mold there blossomed a strange species of flower with thin grey stems, drooping white petals, and light yellow pollen. Peregrine extinguished his torchlight, and Oliver was surprised to be enveloped by a natural luminescence that glimmered inside the tunnel. Minute spots, in hundreds and thousands, glowed from inside the rock itself and shot rays of red light in every direction. And some of these hit the petals of the flowers, and then another light, white and softer, poured out into the tunnel. Peregrine pointed ahead as the tunnel started to expand. And if you'd like that, just take a look at this, the Garden of Filbert. Soon they were standing in a great underground chamber, its roof fashioned into an enormous dome speckled with white, red, and green beams of light, its wide walls wrapping around the two boys like a colosseum. and its floor rising and falling at its own want. More beautiful still were the little streams of silver blue which gushed out of holes in the grey walls of rock, and which rushed through the natural channels furnished by the hills. These fast currents occasionally joined forces to form busy little ponds, which, in turn, soon emptied their bellies so as to give rise to the next set of tributaries. Out of the water leapt schools of flying fish, with eyes as large as dinner plates, and even larger, darker shapes could be discerned patrolling the bottom of the waterways. Peregrine emptied the last dregs of water from his bottle into a moss-covered bank, and then filled the flask to the brim with a fresh supply from the stream at his feet. "You'd better not try drinking with your hands, Oliver. Some of those big fellows down there have sharp fangs. Use my bottle, rather." "I wouldn't mind a bite of fish for dinner," remarked Oliver. "The mushrooms are much easier to pick, and they won't try to nick your fingers off when you pluck them out," said Peregrine, who was pointing to a thick bed of black-spotted, white-stemmed champignons scattered across the hill above them. "These small ones here are a bit on the sweet side. A good dessert. Personally, I like to start a meal with the bigger ones over there." Oliver's gaze was directed to the opposite hill across the stream. There, the mushroom trunks grew to a healthy height, and their roofs were so wide that one could fall asleep under a canopy and escape the bright floodlights of the dome. "They're more savory, and if you mix them in a bowl with some boiling water, you can make quite a tasty soup." "And how are you going to boil water, Peregrine?" "Well, I don't have to boil water. The geezers do that for you. Look over there." Sure enough, from several of the hilltops, thin spouts of steam were whistling skyward and widening to white clouds. To one of these smoky turrets the two hungry boys headed, leaping over a narrow stream with the sharp-fanged fish snapping at their heels and charging up the moss-coated slope of the slippery rise. Passing by one of the lofty mushrooms, each boy ripped off a handful of the fibrous tissue from the crumbly roof, and they halted at the crest of the tall hill, where the natural sauna plastered their brows with beads of sweat.
Thank you.
Right, Jeroen. Thanks, Jeroen. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.